On June 8, 793, men from the edge of the world landed on holy ground. The shock arrived before its meaning could be understood. This was not a battle in any ordinary sense, but panic moving through sacred spaces never designed to resist intrusion. The first sign of violence was not bloodshed, but a flash of metal suggesting force had entered a protected world. What followed changed everything, because these strangers did not just reach Lindisfarne, they crossed into Europe's symbolic refuge. It was not remembered merely as theft. Its deeper force came from violating a place people believed could not be touched. The scattered manuscripts mattered because they captured interruption itself, prayer, order, and memory broken abruptly in the middle of motion. Geography shaped the choice. From land, Lindisfarne looked holy and remote. From the sea, it looked exposed and reachable. What changed everything was this: sacred buildings held meaning and wealth, yet almost none of the defensive logic of fortresses. This was not only fear of attackers, it was the moment familiar categories of danger suddenly stopped making sense. The coastline mattered as much as the monastery, because access by sea made the sacred site structurally and operationally vulnerable. Behind the choice was asymmetry. Symbolic wealth gathered in one place, protected more by belief, ritual, and habit than force. What changed Europe's imagination was this: the target was not military strength, but visible prestige left almost completely unguarded. Why would unknown warriors attack a monastery instead of an army? The question mattered because strategy had become more revealing than outrage. This was the first real pattern break. Distance did not stop the streak, and remoteness did not guarantee safety. The sea was not an empty barrier. It functioned as a corridor for timing, discipline, and carefully managed surprise. Behind the strike was root logic, not impulse. An isolated monastery could be reached before defenders even understood the threat. This was not random. Someone calculated this. The map turns shock into intention, and intention into the first outline of a system.
Lindisfarne was no poor monastery. Portable wealth lay openly in sacred rooms, where reverence had replaced nearly every practical defense. Lindisfarne stored prestige in usable form: jeweled books, ritual metalwork, and sacred objects that could be seized with alarming speed. At the center was simple concentration: silver, liturgical tools, and symbolic authority gathered together inside one accessible sacred chamber. The altar was more than a religious space. It was also a visible center of wealth, status, and concentrated meaning. Yet this was no fortress. The monastery stood exposed on the coast, vital to faith, but fragile against sudden arrival. Its remoteness increased its danger. Lindisfarne seemed protected by isolation, yet the sea turned isolation into direct access. The logic was clear: a spiritual symbol, a prestige site, and a soft coastal storehouse fused into one target. This is where the myth breaks. They were not striking blindly at wealth, but choosing architecture that could barely resist. The route mattered as much as the treasure. A reachable coastline made sacred concentration tactically valuable and unusually vulnerable. The imbalance was stark: immense symbolic value within, almost no military structure beyond, and no real defensive depth between. Attacking a central bank with no security. Lindisfarne concentrated prestige and portable wealth while offering almost none of power's protections. Seen coldly, Lindisfarne was not only holy. It was visible, wealthy, exposed, and remarkably easy to enter from the sea. But that was not the full answer. Gold explains attraction, not why the shock echoed so far across Europe. Treasure was the obvious explanation, which is exactly why it can conceal the deeper strategic logic behind the raid. The strike meant more than theft. Hitting a revered node carried consequences far beyond the objects physically taken away. It changed the target's meaning, turning one monastery from a storehouse of wealth into a message heard across continents. But gold wasn't the main objective. The deeper effect was psychological, and its reach would surpass the raid's physical scale. The attack grew larger once it was written down. Ink turned local violence into something portable, repeatable, and feared. The real force was informational. Witnesses and clergy would carry the shock onward without the raiders needing to control it.
Rumor moved through monasteries, ports, and courts faster than ships could cross the sea, widening the strike's psychological reach. This was not simple panic. It was theological disbelief that sacred protection had failed in a place thought divinely sheltered. Every letter carried more than facts. It carried dread, atmosphere, and the sense that established order had begun to crack. Even restrained accounts made the event feel larger than its manpower, giving one raid the weight of something systemic. It changed Christian consciousness because the room itself remained standing, while confidence in its sanctity no longer did. Once testimony was sealed and sent, the raid stopped being local memory and became a distributed warning across Europe. The multiplier was institutional. Networks built for religion and administration became channels through which fear could travel efficiently. In elite correspondence, the event felt almost apocalyptic, as though signs long feared had suddenly entered history uninvited. This was not melodrama. The shoreline's silence mattered because it stood against a mental rupture already moving inland. The attackers did not need to appear everywhere. News of one successful strike expanded the effect on their behalf. The real power lay in institutions, bells, letters, and clerical routes spreading alarm faster than armies could ever mobilize. The raid worked because fear travels faster than ships. One coastal strike gained continental reach by turning information into force. Now the investigation turns. The emotional shock is clear enough, but the mechanics of arrival remain unanswered. The longship was not merely a dramatic symbol, it was a transport system built for speed, timing, and controlled access. Behind the strike was maritime competence. Open water was no barrier if crews already knew how to turn it into approach. How did they even get here? The question resets the inquiry, shifting from spreading fear to the mechanics of execution. The raid's first advantage was timing, and the shoreline still preserves that truth in the traces left by arrival. This landing was not clumsy or improvised. The vessel reached shore at the point where delay could be kept minimal. The sequence can still be reconstructed. From sea to target, the movement forms a controlled chain rather than a burst of chaos. What followed changed everything, because the men crossed open ground by function, dividing movement with the discipline of prior practice. This was not a mob. Hands, tools, and motion reveal separate tasks unfolding at once within a very narrow window. Coastline geometry mattered. The shortest route from landing point to monastery reduced exposure and accelerated access to concentrated valuables. The threshold itself explains part of the logic. A space designed for worship offered almost nothing against speed and intent. Once inside, the path from doorway to portable wealth was brutally short, direct, and immediately legible to the attackers. The raid reads as sequence: land, divide, breach, collect, withdraw, all before organized resistance had time to form. Retreat showed the same discipline as arrival. The same economy of motion limited time ashore and kept overall risk low. What followed changed everything, because the attackers were gone before defenders could turn shock into any meaningful response. Witnesses remembered not only the violence, but how little time existed to understand what was unfolding around them. The falling book matters. because confusion arrived faster than interpretation, leaving the witness unable to classify the event in time. Ground-level speed tells its own story. Retreating footsteps show what operational efficiency feels like from inside sacred space. What changed everything was this: the witness did not see a battle, but categories collapsing under sudden motion and sound. This was not melodrama. The room itself became evidence of a breach too swift for prayer, authority, or routine to answer. The scattered clues now align. Coastline traces, entry paths, valuables, and withdraw together form something coldly repeatable. Structure is the key. The same sequence can be visualized step by step, turning one episode into transferable method.
Lindisfarne stops looking accidental once its mechanics begin to resemble a formula that can be carried elsewhere and repeated. This was not chaos, it was a prototype. The raid now reads as a model, not an isolated convulsion of violence. The deeper importance lay here. Success converted loot into capacity for future movement, repetition, and return on a larger scale. Raiding worked as reinvestment. Captured wealth could be turned into ships, tools, provisions, and wider operational reach. Behind it was a hard economic loop. Prior success supplied the material base for more ambitious expeditions to follow. What changed everything was visible return. It attracted labor, trust, and new participants more effectively than ideology ever could. This was not simple repetition. Every successful route reduced uncertainty and widened the range of what crews believed possible. Remembered pathways became infrastructure. Experience lowered risk by turning movement itself into stored and usable practical knowledge. Like venture capital, fueled by violence. The point is not wit, but proof that success financed scalable operational learning. One successful strike could now fund multiple departures, multiplying reach without requiring anything like a centralized state. This was not the end of Lindisfarne's importance. It created a precedent that made other sacred coasts newly imaginable as targets. Every isolated monastery now looked different. Exposure had been revealed, and imagination carried the consequence farther than ships. A permanent shift in perception had begun. Bells, doors, and sanctity no longer implied protection against disciplined maritime force. What changed everything was this: once route arrows pushed inland, vulnerabilities stopped being merely coastal or symbolic. This was not just fear. Religious networks began reading the strike as proof that older assumptions about safety had failed. Once a method works, imitation becomes likely. Potential targets multiply first in the imagination, then across the map. A new habit of watching the sea had begun. Sacred spaces could no longer afford to think only inward. Now, Europe contained more exposed nodes than any existing response system could realistically defend at once. And this success would inspire the largest Viking army ever seen. The precedent points forward, quietly but unmistakably, toward organized expansion. After Lindisfarne, Europe was no longer safe. One monastery proved that symbolic wealth and sacred space were penetrable at scale. The pattern mattered for a larger reason. One ship can shock, but many ships announce multiplication. The map itself now makes the argument. Routes no longer point to one raid, but to widening operational possibility. Scale pressure had begun to build. Too many vulnerable coasts were appearing at once for old defensive imagination to contain. Lindisfarne now resolves into system, and a system never stops at the first moment it proves that it works.
Expansion continued because raiding fit neatly into older maritime circuits already linking goods, people, movement, and opportunity across the north. Baltic movement mattered because exchange networks had already trained crews to think in routes, harbors, timing, and coastal reach. Violence did not stand apart from trade. It moved within broader systems of circulation, transfer, and material exchange. What followed changed everything, because captive movement and profit routes folded raiding into a harsher and wider economic structure. This was not isolated brutality. Sea lanes and inland corridors tied raiding to commerce, transport, and the geography of movement. Pauses mattered almost as much as strikes. Seasonal waiting turned mobility into a cycle that could be repeated with intention. Raiding followed a maritime rhythm, windows of weather, navigability, and return that made recurrence not accidental, but structurally plausible. What changed everything was that knowledge did not disappear after each voyage. It continued through memory, repetition, and practice. This was not random repetition. Routes became clearer through reuse, then teachable through familiarity, and dependable through repeated success. Ordinary gear reveals the point. Repeated expeditions create routine, and routine steadily lowers the cost of future aggression. Behind expansion stood a wider world of movement. Trade, ports, and ships provided the channels through which raiding could scale. What changed everything was overlap. Once trade routes, captive routes, and raid routes merged, violence became system rather than episode. This was not only about money. Repetition was quietly building crews whose movements no longer depended on improvisation alone. Smooth preparation is its own evidence of skill. What looks simple on deck is usually the product of repeated correction. Memory was hardening into certainty. The same corridor grows safer to the raider each time it is crossed successfully. What changed everything was that loot purchased more than ships. It purchased tested procedure and growing confidence in it. This was not just survival. Repairs, scars, and adjustments show how each return preserved lessons inside the tools themselves. Organization becomes visible before doctrine does. Several prepared vessels suggest learning has already spread beyond a single crew. What formed here was memory without institutions, repeated routes, practiced labor, and shared experience operating like stored intelligence. Raiding created something far more dangerous: experience. Not just wealth, but skilled crews, tested procedure, and memory surviving every retreat. What followed changed everything, because the logic of coastal strikes could now move inland through river access toward Paris. This was not a new mentality. It was the same method reaching farther because crews had learned how distance could be managed. Ireland mattered not as a side theater, but as another cluster of reachable nodes within the same expanding pattern. Recurrence was the real point. Another exposed monastery on another coast proved the method traveled more easily than institutions expected. What changed everything was that Scotland, too, could be folded into familiar maritime logic without reinventing the system. This was not random spread. Multiplied ships suggest confidence, seasonal return, and the normalization of repeated operational reach. Paris, Ireland, and Scotland belong in one sequence because each became another node touched by the same method. Behind it was disciplined expansion. Scale increased, but the underlying procedure remained recognizable from one region to the next. What changed everything was that the prototype no longer read as local history. It now read as continental recurrence. This was the deeper danger. The real threat was a system that improved simply by continuing to operate. Every successful raid refined planning. Gear, repair, and preparation reveal adaptation happening quietly between the visible events themselves. Transmission mattered most. Crews did not need formal schools to teach one another what worked and what failed. What changed everything was that repeated routes narrowed uncertainty, making future violence more efficient and therefore more scalable. This was not merely retreat. Every withdrawal preserved knowledge, and that knowledge returned later as improved capability.
Each target taught the next crew what was possible, turning geography itself into a form of remembered instruction. Operational memory was now in motion. Every new departure carried the corrections, confidence, and ambition of the previous return. Europe wasn't facing bandits, it was facing a learning machine. The real threat was adaptation, repetition, and improvement through practice.
The pattern mattered for what came next. Raiders were beginning to move beyond coasts and toward power deeper inland. Longer stays changed the logic. A shore camp suggests presence beginning to outlast the strike that first created it. Duration altered everything. Once supplies remain in place, violence starts to borrow the structure and rhythm of occupation. What followed changed everything, because fragmented political space offered leverage where a single united defense might have endured longer. This was not only about movement. Repeated footprints inland suggest the shift from brief landing to recurring presence. Rivers functioned as strategic doors, allowing coastal mobility to become inland penetration without surrendering the advantages of maritime movement. The real leverage lay in route control. Attacks matter differently once they can threaten territory, not merely seize portable wealth. What happens when raiders become settlers? The question begins here, in camps that look less temporary with each returning season. Even a banner changes meaning when it remains. Presence becomes signal, and signal slowly begins to resemble claim. What happens when raids become invasions? The map now points beyond monasteries toward political centers that can be pressured or seized. A historical transformation was taking shape. The sacred coast now looks like a threshold, not the final arena of danger. What followed changed everything, because the system was no longer testing routes alone, it was testing how power might be held. This was not the climax. The ships waiting in fog feel less like memory now and more like unfinished intention. The target set was widening. Kingdoms were becoming imaginable in the same way monasteries once had been before Lindisfarne. Movement was being reoriented. It no longer pointed only toward plunder, but toward possession, leverage, and eventually rule. What followed changed everything, because temporary camps teach where to stay, and staying teaches how territory can be dominated. This was not Lindisfarne's ending. It was the demonstration that a method could widen from shock into conquest. The coastline is no longer the whole story. The deeper land now holds the greater danger and the larger prize. Within decades, they would stop hitting monasteries and start taking kingdoms. Lindisfarne was not the climax, but the demonstration.